quickly.
Well, it's that time of year again, the time of year when I must once again humble myself and remind everyone of the failure that was my self-published fantasy series. The Architects of the Gifted, what was to be a 4-book series that kind of... It got the guillotine after book 2. Fun fact, I still have a Word document with a fair bit of book number 3.
I would say that it takes a lot of humility to stop your series. To basically to come to that acceptance, to say like, you know what, I've messed up irrevocably to where I can no longer go on. I'm just gonna have to stop, sadly, rather than bulldoze through and mess it up worse, I guess. I do hope that he did exhaust all options available to him. I don't know exactly I'm not sure exactly what the issue was. I think he described it earlier as he wrote himself into a corner that he really could not get out of. So I hope that, and I trust him. I don't think that he didn't, but I just hope that if anyone else kind of feels this way, that your book series is not going the way that you want it to go, or it's getting out of control or whatnot, I do hope that you exhaust all options before you give up.
Actually written never to see the light of day, unless... What's shaking? My name's Cam. Welcome back to another video. So yeah, here's the short version. When I was young, dumb, and full of common ramen noodles, I wrote and published 2 books in what was to be a 4-book urban fantasy YA series. I maintain to this day that the writing itself wasn't terrible. That's not why I took them down. When I took these books down and made them unavailable to purchase anymore, I did it with one promise. This is it.
That's also very good of him to take them down, to not keep selling them when he knows he's never going to finish.
This is my one and only blank slate card. This is the only time I'm allowed to do this, where I can take down my stuff. I made a lot of mistakes writing this series that at the time I didn't really care to look into because I was naive. I thought at the time, I've read a lot, I've done courses on writing. I know what I'm doing. I didn't. The purpose of this video isn't to go through all of the very specific writing mistakes that I made, because I already made a video on that, kind of roasting myself, but the writing will be at least a small part of it. What I want to do is list out all of the ingredients that went into this cauldron of crap soup. Before I do, I just want to make one thing very clear. I don't hate myself for writing these books or publishing these books. I don't even necessarily regret it, I think. Although I was definitely too overconfident, I had to learn the hard way that I still had a lot to learn. Publishing these books did make one thing very clear to me. I can do this. I can write and publish books. The question was, can I do it better? There were a lot of reasons that I took the books down, primarily because I wrote myself into a corner that I wasn't able to fix, and I didn't want people to be able to purchase a series that I didn't have any intention of finishing, but I don't want to pretend that they never happened.
Okay.
Anytime someone asks me for my favorite writing tip or my number one writing advice, I have one very clear and dominant answer. What you might not know is that the reason that answer is so clear and dominant to me is because of this failed fantasy series. The tip is, don't rush it. I remember I wrote The Scarlet Reaper over a number of years, on and off. It wasn't a quick process by any means. At that point, it was just a pipe dream. Publishing this, it didn't seem like a real thing, like a real idea. But I remember it was a pretty unremarkable day where I just kind of sat down and I was just writing for a long time, and then I realized it's done. I finished it. And at that point, I thought to myself, you know what? I'm just going to do it. I'll just publish it. What's the worst that could happen? And
one thing I'm going to say about finishing, it feels bad that like we use the word finish for like finishing your rough draft, and it's the correct word, but then it's also like, but you're not done, and you technically have to start all over almost, because you got to go back to the beginning and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. I don't know. I kind of wish that there was, because it's one of those mental things, right? It's one of those mental triggers where you say, I'm done, and then you feel done, and then you want to be done, but you're not done. You got a lot more work to do. As a matter of fact, you probably have more work in front of you than you do behind. So I kind of wish there was a different word that kind of held the same feeling of like, I'm done, I did it, I did the rough draft, I got the story out, but that didn't trick the mind into thinking that, oh, we're finished with this thing, we can put it down and move on to the next project.
Initially, I did plan to do it properly, step by step, with all of the professional editing and the professional work that goes into a book to polish it and make it good, or at least as good as it can be, aside from the story itself. All of that fell apart on the first week. I'm pretty sure it was like a couple of days, and as soon as I'd formatted the Word document and realized, I'm really doing this. At some point in the near future, I'm really going to have a book in my hands that I created, and that to me, it was almost too much. Unfortunately, that was the moment that I was doomed to fail, because as soon as I realized that I was going to do this, I rushed through the rest like the cop from, Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs. I couldn't afford at that point to get the manuscript professionally edited, so I just didn't. I could have waited, I could have saved up my money and done that, but I didn't.
I would say definitely want to be edited. If you're really in a situation where you cannot get an editor, and that's also including like trying to trade services, right? If you really can't save up and you really can't afford an editor, the only other option that you really have at that point is to really take your time with doing your self-edit. I've mentioned before that when I one of my processes, one of my steps is that I read backwards. Not literally every word going backwards, but I read like the last line first, and then I read like the next line after that, and the next line after that, and I'm just reading in that way. For that, the purpose of that is to catch spelling mistakes, like missing words, punctuation errors, because I don't want to let myself fall into the flow and the rhythm of the writing, which then my brain might start putting in words, might start auto-correcting things, because then I know, like, I'm reading the sentence and I know what I mean, and so then I'm like, oh, of course it says he did not walk down the road, but I didn't have the not in there. It just says he walked down the road, right? Literally the opposite of what I want to convey. But because my brain, I remember this scene and I remember this sentence, it's supposed to say he did not do the thing, I just mentally put in the word not. And that's why as one of my own self-edit techniques is I will read backwards. If you are not able to afford an editor, that is one of the things that you could do. There's other, obviously, my point is basically to really take your time with the self-edit process to clean it up as much as you can. Distance yourself, give yourself, 2, 3, maybe even 4 months in between since you last touched it. Leave it alone, come back to it a number of months later, pick it back up, and that way again it's a lot more fresh. You don't have these prose that you thought you wrote in your mind that show up to your brain even though they're not on the page. So that would be my advice for people who are you really just don't have the money for it, and you really can't trade services. That'd be the one thing I would say though, is like if you don't have the money for it, you should probably be able to trade services, saying like, hey, I'll edit or critique your manuscript if you do mine, or I'll do yours and then owe you some, because basically maybe it's like the word count's not the same. Let's say like you're gonna read one of their 60,000 word books, but you've got 140. You might say, hey, I'll do yours and I'll owe you another one as well. Whenever you write another one, I'll do it for you if you do mine, that kind of thing. That's also an option. something like that. You know, you gotta be creative about these things. You can't cut corners and just say, well, I don't have an editor, so I'm going to skip that part. That part has to happen.
And it was a mistake. Now, the second book, The Whisper War, that was an even worse situation, even though technically I think this is a much better book. This book was published and for sale about 3 weeks after the first draft was finished. Yeah, I know. I had a problem that I think a lot of first-time self-published authors will have, and that is being way too keen to get the book out there, to get it done, to get it into your hand.
And this kind of goes on what I was saying in the other video where he talks about he's going to be doing where he said basically he wanted to write 3 books, and then that way he's got kind of this lead going, is that you might fall into the temptation of your audience going, oh man, I loved your first book, when is book 2 coming? And technically you've got book 2 sitting right there, maybe completely ready to go. Let's say that you've already even done all the edits, you've done everything, like it's actually ready to go right now. But if you want to keep that lead that you have, right, you wrote 3 books out in order to have this kind of lead, so that way you can be writing further down the road as the other books come out, then you've got to wait, right? You got to have that patience and wait for the right time to actually release it. So he's absolutely right here. A lot of newer authors, really just a lot of authors in general, once you put all that work in, you want to be rewarded for the work, right? Especially if this is like your full-time job, you want to get that money, right? You want to get that return on investment. So yeah, it's going to be pretty hard to hold on to books 2 and 3 if you already have them written, when everyone, you know, who likes your book is asking for more, and you want to give it to them. It's right there. It's going to be kind of tough.
And I know it's not really about the money, it's just that you want to do it. You're excited, you just want to do it, and that's fine.
It's about the money too.
Don't rush it, because you will regret it.
That's one of the things I think a lot about when people talk about, like, are you doing this just for the money, or are you doing it for the fun? Why is it an either or? Why is it not a both and? I'm doing it both for the fun and the money. Like, I want to get paid to have fun like anyone else does, right? Everyone, the dream of the millennial childhood is that you grow up and you get paid to do the things that you were doing as a kid, right? How many of us were, you know, like reading Game Informer or reading Nintendo Power, reading these magazines where we're like, wow, these people are literally getting paid to play video games, right? You got alpha testers who are paid to play video games, right? That's what I want to do when I grow up. I just want to get paid to have fun. That is what writing is. Writing is a lot of fun. There are obviously some tough moments to it, but there's a lot of fun going on with it. And you know, a lot of writing is also reading, right? I basically read to help my craft, and reading is fun. So why not? Why is it, are you doing this for the money, or are you doing this for like the art or the craft or the fun? Why is all the good stuff over here and the money is somehow separate from that? It's like, no, I want both. I want both.
I may have taken these books down, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist, or that people will forget all of the typos and the fact that the text was not justified. What the hell was I thinking? Not justified. Looks terrible. There's another tip for you. Justify the text before you finish formatting. But the thing is, I don't want people to forget about these. I don't want people to forget that I messed up. That's why I'm creating this video, so that I can remind myself more than anyone else that sometimes you have to take a step back from what you've created. Here is a writing related point as far as the stories inside the covers go. A writing point that did play a pretty big part in me taking down the books. See, the thing is, like I said before, I wrote myself into a corner. It was during the writing of book 3 that I realized I'd created way too many plot holes and random subplots that I just couldn't tie up, and the whole thing ended up being pretty much doomed to fail. Of all the poor choices that I made with the actual story itself, the biggest I think is that I had the first story jump from major story beat to major story beat with nearly no time to breathe. It's basically the don't rush it point again, but this time with the story and the writing rather than the publishing. I like to think that I'm pretty good at writing big action sequences. That's where I kind of shine, in my opinion. Unfortunately, what that means is, in the first book, I was focusing pretty much entirely on the stuff that I thought I was good at, and not spending any time and attention on the stuff that I could probably get better at. That means there was very little character development and emotionally driven elements of the story, which are very important. It was meant to be a fun little cozy, adventure quest story with a small group of people that become a family, that become very strongly bonded. But looking back on it, they barely had any time together or any dialogue together outside of all of the fighting and the running. And sure, you can make characters bond pretty hard over protecting each other in physical altercations, but if you don't have them slow down every now and then and connect on a more emotional level, the reader's not going to care. Another huge thing is I also sidelined the love interest, and, well, she was the driving force for the whole plot, for the entire story. That is, though, one of the very few things I'm willing to kind of forgive myself for. I was inexperienced and I was trying way too hard to create your classic damsel in distress story. We were supposed to believe that our hero Carter was willing to risk his life for the girl that he loves, although we had little to no build-up or exposure to that love before she was whisked away and put into danger. Not great, I know, the whole damsel in distress thing, it's very outdated, but young Cam still had a few years ahead of him before he would become more cynical, before his outlook on love would become a little less optimistic, so, enjoy it while you can, dickhead. So
There's nothing wrong with damsel in distress as long as you do it right. Again, any trope that you can think of is probably doable. It's just, you've probably seen a lot of bad examples of it. It just takes the right finesse to do it.
I'm going to read for you now the opening for the very first book. So the first thing you see, the very first thing that you read. Few people know the truth about the remarkable beings that live and walk among us. History has always seen them turned into fantasy or erased altogether. Even fewer still know how those beings came to be. The reason for our existence has been given many names and many faces through time all over the world, but the truth is that at the very beginning of all things, before conscious thought was even remotely existent, there was a great empty universe. It was beautiful in its isolation. There was no noise, no stars, no light, and no color. It was a nothingness that can simply not be fathomed. There is no reason for this, and there is no need for one. Things remained like this for a moment or a millennia. There is no way to truly know. But eventually, just as simply as there was nothing, a spark ignited in the vast emptiness. Just like that, it was the birth of something remarkable. An entity that can barely be described as alive, but at the same time was a mixture of everything and anything that could and would ever be. No words can describe this entity. It is simply energy at its purest. They are the cosmic architects that built us and put away the blueprint. They are the Demiurgos. As you are now painfully aware, the story starts with a very dense info dump. Right from the get-go. Bad idea. Don't do that. With writing fantasy now, the new fantasy series that I'm working on, that I'm super excited about, by the way, it's so much fun. I've made a real point of trying to teach the reader about the world and about the lore and this fantasy place through the characters. When a character in the story learns something, so does the reader. Now, you do have to be careful with that, because if you have one character explaining to another character something that that character should already know, or if it just doesn't feel natural, or if it just it's just kind of stilted and very obvious that the author is just trying to tell you something. If it ends up as an info dump, you will get what is called the "as you know Bob" trope. As you know Bob, at the beginning of time, there was a great empty nothingness, blah blah blah. Sometimes you can provide info directly from the narrator or as a character's internal monologue, but you really shouldn't overdo that, sir. Knowing when it's a good time to pass on some exposition and how to make that feel natural is part of what is going to make you look like a competent or even a good author.
Yeah, this is one of the reasons why when I wrote my original book, I got a lot of feedback on it that people just were not catching on to the character, not catching on to the world. And so I decided, okay, you know what? I need to. And this was also like, probably my poor writing at the time too. This is a number of years ago. I decided to go back and say, okay, we're going to start further back. We're going to start further back then. And that way they can get more used to the character. They can get more used to the world. We'll do that. So in book 1, I have basically the trope of the farmer kid. Basically, the kid who's been sheltered his whole life. You've seen it in tons of different book series where they're not familiar with the world that they're going to go into for some reason. In this case, it happens to be that he has been trained as a monk for 20 years. So he's been up in a monastery segregated from the world the entire time. So now coming down into the world, that puts a lot of strain and a lot of tension onto his belief systems and his trust and everything like that of the people who raised him. So it's one of it does add into the tension of the novel, right? But in doing this, by doing this trope of the main character doesn't know is kind of what the trope really is. I think it's called the farmer boy trope or something like that, or the farmer trope. But whatever it's called, it's basically the main character doesn't know. I mean, Harry Potter was doing it too. Harry Potter understands the regular world, but he doesn't understand the wizarding world. So it's a trope that I'm sure that we've all seen at least once, where the main character enters into a fantastical world and they have to learn about it. But that is like a gateway to teach the reader about it. This is a very nice, gentle learning curve for the reader. Some other books have made it to where it's very much less no, you just had to pick it up as you go, and that's it. Malice and Book of the Fallen series, I've noted that a number of times from Steven Erikson. It's very much just we're going, deal with it, right? The Brandon Sanderson talks about the learning curve is that for Harry Potter. For Brandon Sanderson, it's immediately you have to climb a cliff and then just go, right? So mine's much more of a slope rather than a steep cliff. So it's one of those things where when you do that trope, it's very common. People don't bash that trope as much as they do other tropes. But I would say that, it can really hamper a story if you're doing what he said before, where the character should know a thing. They should know what's going on here because they're part of this world. But then another character has to explain it to the main character, and that's really them explaining it to you, the reader, because the main character should be aware of whatever's going on. You really got to watch out for that kind of stuff because it stands out very, very loudly to the reader. We see that immediately.
Don't make the books in the series different sizes. I didn't do that. I'm just telling you that you shouldn't either.
Don't make the books in the series different sizes? What?
Don't make the books in the series different sizes. I didn't do that. I'm just telling you that you shouldn't either. Look
at these Harry Potters. look at this chunky boy, right? Look at this chunky boy, right? You can have different sizes, but yes, I mean, if you're like starting off at like 60,000 words, don't jump to 140, don't jump to 220 or something like that. Don't be crazy. I would agree with this to a certain degree. I wouldn't think that if you wrote your first book at 130,000 words, your next book can't be more than 150. So like, you have to cut it down to that. You have to get in range of that 130 or something like that. That's not, I wouldn't really agree with that. I would just say, don't shock your audience, right? Don't shock your audience either way. Don't go super way bigger than what it was before. Don't go super way less than what it was before. Be aware of what you set your readers up for, and then kind of if you're going to go higher, and a lot of authors, they have to start off kind of smaller because the publishing company is not going to take that risk on them. So they start off with like 130, 140,000 words. This is for fantasy, by the way. If it's fantasy, it's something else. Then and you go for a longer word count. Don't jump too much, but kind of go a little bit at a time. Oh, you think he meant physical size as in height? Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Well, I mean, the thing is, though, you're going to have different heights. You're going to have different heights, Like, I've got book 7 here. I've got House of Chains is way bigger than these. Like, you're going to have different sizes. That's... if you're self-publishing, you have more control over that, obviously. But if you are traditionally published, they're going to publish your book in all sorts of shapes and sizes just to have more uniformity between paperback and hardback. I mean, this right here, this bigger one here is just another paperback, even though it's like way bigger than these other ones. So there's going to be differences. But I would say if you have one book that's like this tall and the next book is only this tall, like you don't have an option for it to be this tall, I would say that would be wrong. So if you're going to print one book at one size, make sure the next book is also the same size. But if you're going to print your book in a couple different sizes, then have the other books in all the same different sizes.
One really big thing that I've learned from writing these books, although it took me way too long to realize it, is to not go too big on the first book. Spoiler alert, but in the first book, leading up to the climax, our heroes come across an army of creatures and enemies outside of a massive fortress that has the big bad, or the first big bad of the series. Sounds pretty cool, right? It's a big epic moment. The problem is, I kind of went all in on that first big epic battle. And that was only the first book. That means in the second book, it has to ramp up even more, and then for the next one, and the next one. I think I did manage that with book 2.
Yeah, ramping up, though, isn't always the same. Like, it's not always this. You don't always have to ramp up in the same vein, right? So, like, for instance, if you have, like, let's say, a war scene, that war scene can be really big and very gritty and all that kind of stuff. Your next war scene, especially if it's in the same book, should be bigger, should have more things at stake. And in the next book, your biggest battle there should probably also be bigger than the biggest battle in your previous book. However, in the next book, you might not have a war scene. You might have a magical dragon fight, or you might have wizards dueling, right? You don't have to always go just physically bigger. You just have to have, like, the right stakes in mind. You have to have the feelings of importance be bigger. That's really where you kind of have to go bigger, is more on the stakes side, more on the emotional side. But I wouldn't say that you always have to have a bigger battle.
To pretty well. Rather than just a small group going up against an army, that small group now has an army of their own. There were more interesting characters with different powers, etc., etc. But what about book 3? And God forbid, what about book 4? Those are some of the corners I mentioned that I was backing myself into. Something I've learned to do is that if I have a cool idea for an action sequence during my writing, rather than finding a way to involve that idea immediately into the story, I will note it down, and once I've noted it down, I have to keep writing as if I hadn't had that idea until a time comes that that idea can be used naturally. I shouldn't have ended the first book with a massive war-style battle. It wasn't even necessary in retrospect. I think it would have made a lot more sense and actually been better to have a more subtle approach for the ending of the first book. The point is, it was too big for the story that I was telling. A series should ideally ramp up like this. Like that. It shouldn't really be ramping up like this. You know, that is the height of showing people how to write books right there. If this doesn't make sense, I don't know what will. I would like to revisit these stories one day and rewrite them, because I think the general concept is actually really good, and funnily enough, I'm super attached to a lot of the characters in here. The three main characters that you spend a lot of the time with, Carter, Becker, Arthur, and Griffin, they're characters that I've been kind of workshopping since I was like in primary school, literally. The series does mean a lot to me, so I do want to get back to it at some point. And I don't regret making these. I learned a lot doing it. I've had a lot of people tell me that taking these down was a mistake, or even that these having existed at all will damage my chances of being traditionally published in the future. And to that, I have to say, I don't care. Like, okay, I don't think that's true, but even if it was, I wouldn't. I don't care. I don't know what to tell you, man. I don't care. It happened. There's nothing I can do about it. It's a big step. I had to learn the hard way that as a writer, I can always improve, and I should always be trying to. I know I still have ways to go, but at this point in time, I know I'm a much better writer than I was back then. I know at no point in time am I ever going to be as good as I could possibly be, so every time I write a book, I just have to try and be the best that I can be right then. Hey, have you had any failed projects? Expose yourself in the comments. Not like, thanks so much for watching, especially for watching through the whole video. I really do appreciate it. And hey, go do some writing. Catch ya.
Gonna watch one more of your videos, Cam, then I'll do some writing.